Hey guys, welcome to the Rant channel, your home for NFL projections, predictions, and of course, your periodic rant. And I wanted to make this video a lot earlier. It's the Black Monday video, but I'm actually glad that I waited because we had a lot more happen since then, a few more openings that I get to discuss in this video. And I'm kind of doing this on a Tuesday. It's the 25th of January when I'm making this video. You might see it today, you might see it a day later, but I'm going to talk about all 9 openings. I'm also going to go over a couple of pros and cons about each one. Try to do at least 2 for every single video, every single team. Before I get into all of that, if you're new to the channel, please make sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and we'll start with our coach openings. And the first team we're going to start with is the Denver Broncos. Now, this probably is the second most glamorous out of all the openings. And a lot of people are probably looking at this and saying that the Saints is the most glorious, but I'm going to get to that. Let's just start with Denver. So, obviously, with every single opening here, there's a few positives to look at. Some more yes than others. But for Denver, I mean, the first positive is the fact that they've been drafting very well the last couple of years. I mean, they've been not doing so great on paper, but draft-wise, they've been doing excellent the past couple of drafts. They've been getting guys like Bradley Chubb, Patrick Surtain, Javonte Williams has been an excellent addition. And there's a reason why Denver was competitive this year. It's because they did a really great job drafting, and they actually were a united team. And Vic Fangio, in my opinion, people might question this. I don't think he should have been fired. I think he could have maybe got one more year. But at the very least, he never lost the locker room. They actually played very tough for him, and they stayed competitive for a while. So this is a team that's united. The second thing to discuss here is salary cap and draft capital. They're in a decent spot. I mean, they're in the top 10. They've got about $45 million next year, and I don't believe they have any big contracts in the offseason. They could even do some restructures to put them at about $50 million. So you could see Denver making a couple of decent splashes. I mean, there's rumors that they could be in the quarterback market for Aaron Rodgers. Personally, I still think that this is the team that has always been my pick to land Deshaun Watson, but in the meantime, I won't list quarterback as a con because this is a team that still, in my opinion, has been drafting well enough that you can overlook the quarterback situation, and once that resolves itself, you're going to, at some point, be in another playoff team, and you're going to be in one of the best divisions. Now, the cons for the Denver Broncos, of course, I have to address it. It's the quarterback issue. I mean, you can blame a lot of this on John Elway if you want to. I think that's a bit of a cop-out. Denver, as a whole right now, has not had a great quarterback since Peyton Manning. Teddy Bridgewater was probably the best of the worst. I think he probably could have maybe been a little bit better than he was, but obviously you didn't get Bridgewater in his prime. You got him on, I'll say, the start of the back 9 of his career, and in my opinion, you need somebody young. I mean, you see all 3 of these divisional opponents getting younger, except for the Raiders, but Derek Carr had an excellent season. Getting younger, getting better at the position, and if you're Denver, you either want to go all in for a veteran that you trust, or you want to start looking at younger options, and it's probably going to take them a couple of years to do it. But that's a thing to consider. Another con to consider is that you're in a really tough division. I mean, any head coach that comes into this division, with the exception of maybe the Chargers head coach, you've got a lot of competition. I mean, Andy Reid and the Chiefs are going to own this division until both of them walk away. And if you're the Denver Broncos, you know that. You're not trying to overthrow Mahomes yet. You're trying to make your own path. And whether that overthrows Mahomes or not, I doubt it, but that's anybody's guess. Denver, in my opinion, there's a lot to be proud of here. I mean, the salary cap, the roster's excellent, but you also have to consider that if they don't solve the quarterback problem this year, they're probably not going to be, unless they find a really good defensive playmaker in terms of either whether it's coordinator or whether it's a head coach has a really good defensive mindset like Vic Fangio did, this team's not going to be competitive for a little bit. But there is a team that is competitive, and the next one is the Raiders. Now, the Raiders, in my opinion, are obviously on paper the best team on this list because they're the only team that made the playoffs, and they wouldn't be looking for a head coach if not for Gruden's scandals. Now, a lot to be proud of here. Um, the pros to this is that a lot of younger players that nobody expected to really step up have been stepping up. I mean, Hunter Renfrow, has been an excellent wide receiver. I mean, Bryan Edwards has done great, and a lot of players on offense have really been gelling together. Now, that definitely solves a lot of problems, especially when you have Derek Carr, who may or may not be here next year. Now, that's a different story we'll talk about in a second. The other pros are that this is a team that just made the playoffs, and there's a lot of optimism for anyone taking over because you're still going to ride that honeymoon for the first couple of weeks. Now, yes, you were a first-round knockout, but that doesn't really matter when you think about teams that make the playoffs. You're happy to just be a part of that. And the Raiders are definitely a team that, in my opinion, has been improving every single year. There's no reason that can stop, even though Gruden's no longer there and Mike Mayock's no longer there. Which leads me to the cons. The cons are you're going to have a whole new front office, which might not necessarily be a bad thing, but whether it's a good thing or not, that's anybody's guess. It really just depends on who they bring in, how they draft, and a lot of people are thinking the Raiders drafted pretty badly these past few with Mike Mayock. I disagree, but in my opinion, the Raiders front office is also going to be a position of emphasis, and they might have already filled it by the time I make this video, but it is still something to consider. The second thing that goes as a con is the uncertainty at the quarterback position. Now, whether Derek Carr stays and gets an extension, or whether they also go out and enter the Aaron Rodgers or potentially Russell Wilson sweepstakes. I mean, the Raiders aren't exactly in the best of spots with the salary cap, but they're not in the worst place either. I mean, you look at the list, and the Raiders have about a little under $28 million, which isn't necessarily a horrible salary cap situation, and that could be before restructures. So you could say anywhere from 30 to 35 million tops. But you also have to consider that there could be players they want to extend on their team. Whether they choose to extend Derek Carr, there could be players that they might want to go out and sign somebody else. They have to pay their draft class. So while the Raiders are probably the best team that has an opening, there are a couple of things that you have to consider would be a bit of a head scratcher, and I won't say a red flag because there's a lot of GMs on this list that are much worse situations. But it is, a big topic, and it's something you have to consider. And speaking of openings with GMs and head coaches, next up are the Bears. Now, the Bears, of course, we knew this was coming. I mean, Matt Nagy, his last season was awful. He wasn't really the worst head coach out there. Obviously not the best, but, he had a little bit of success. He got 2 playoff berths with the Bears and a division title that they hadn't had since 2011, I believe, was the last time. But I digress. The pros for the Bears are, and I'm going to have to just throw it out there, the pros are the fact that the defense actually has been a pretty decent group. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a little bit of an instance where they take a step back. Nagy's not a defensive guy, but he did put the right coordinators in place to keep the defense competitive. And you have guys like Khalil Mack that are still on the team, and despite the emergence of other linebackers, Khalil Mack is still a playmaker, and he's someone you can build around and should build around. The second thing to consider is that Justin Fields is so young that he's also a bit of a wild card that can go into any GM's decision when joining this team. Now, the Bears, in terms of salary cap, also another honorable mention. They're in a decent spot. They're in the top 10 for salary cap. They're at about, you could say right now it's at 34 and change million. You could say 40 million tops with restructures. But also, we have to remember that the Bears' cons are also things to consider. I mean, the cons for the Bears are this whole division could look a lot different. Now, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. If Aaron Rodgers, does leave Green Bay, then Justin Fields could be the best quarterback in the division on paper for any potential hire. But Justin Fields, my jury's still out on him, in my opinion. I don't think he was bad last year, but he certainly wasn't great. And, I still want to see a lot more from him. But, it's a rookie season, so, I'll give him a pass on that. But a big con for me is the fact that this offense is still very spotty outside of him. I mean, David Montgomery is an outlier. he's been playing very well. I won't, dock them too much on that. But the wide receiver position spotty. I still have some questions about the long-term stability. But the fact remains, the Bears opening is a pretty decent one, and I would say it's probably in the top 3 glamorous openings on this list, despite the GM not being filled yet, despite the fact that their division is a little tough with Green Bay, but I still think with the right person in charge of both sides of the front office and, of course, the head coaching spot, this team can be competitive in the wild card race again. The next team on this list is the Jaguars. Now, the Jaguars are also another team that didn't have to be in this position. Now, it's easy to blame everything on Urban Meyer, but we'll get to the cons in a minute. The big pros on this team, the elephant in the room, is Trevor Lawrence. I mean, I put more emphasis on this than Justin Fields because, in my opinion, Trevor Lawrence has a higher pedigree in what he can do, and he's a much, much hotter commodity, in my opinion, on paper than Justin Fields is. And Trevor Lawrence's rookie season was abysmal, but again, I don't blame that all on him. I think that if the Week 18 game against the Colts is any indication of what he's capable of in terms of being able to win when you least expect it and being able to keep the Jaguars competitive, then they're in for a treat. Now, the second pro on this list is the fact that the Jaguars have a lot of capital and salary cap to work with. Now, the only team with a higher salary cap on this list than the Jaguars are the Dolphins. They're number 1. The Jaguars are number 3. I think they have a little over $60 million in the cap, and that's before restructures. And I don't think they have many, but even still, without the restructures, they're in a good spot. Now, the cons on this list, the big ones, and I've said from day one that Urban Meyer was not and is not the biggest problem with this Jacksonville team, even though he's gone, even though his scandals, put the owner in a position where he didn't have a choice and had to get rid of him. The Jaguars were a problem before Urban Meyer. They're still a problem after Urban Meyer. And with all due respect to whoever the head coach is going to be, unless he's a miracle worker, the big problem with Jacksonville still exists, and it's the GM, Trent Baalke. The guy is a complete idiot. He doesn't know what he's doing in terms of rebuilding, in terms of free agency. He dropped the ball big time last year, which is why the Jaguars, in my opinion, were as bad as they were. I mean, and people say, oh, we drafted Trevor Lawrence, but I mean, I know nothing about being a GM on a football team, and even I know to draft Trevor Lawrence first overall. That's probably the one thing he did right, which a brain-dead monkey would have drafted Trevor Lawrence and probably would have drafted a lot better throughout the rest of it. And the one big thing he did, he didn't need to do. I mean, the guy spent his biggest move signing a cornerback when you just drafted one in the top 10 the year before. I mean, it's a complete dumpster fire in the front office. And it's actually a big reason why a lot of coaching candidates don't want to work in Jacksonville because of Trent Baalke. And the second biggest con is just that there's so many needs. And while that might not always be the worst thing because of their capital and salary cap, I don't trust Trent Baalke enough to fix it. And I think they're going to be in a situation similar to the Texans where, minus Trevor Lawrence, you have a team that has so many gaping holes everywhere. And this is just going to be a complete and utter disaster for whatever coach joins this team. As much as I like Trevor Lawrence, as much as I would love to see Jacksonville improve, until Trent Baalke's gone, I don't see it happening. Next up is Houston. Speaking of the Texans, this is an opening that really should not exist, in my opinion. This is just completely ridiculous. I mean, I've gone to bat for Urban Meyer, but I understand the scandals. He kind of had to go. David Culley did not have to go. The pros on this team, and I'm really going to struggle because, with all due respect to the Texans, this is going to be a struggle for me to find pros. The first pro for me is Davis Mills. Now, whether he's the guy or not, that's a different argument, but the guy at least played with grit and actually really played like he belongs in Houston, and he's probably the one player that played competitively. Now, there's a lot of things I can't blame on the Texans because when your star quarterback Deshaun Watson doesn't want to play or can't play or whatever the story is there, when J.J. Watt leaves, when Whitney Merciless leaves, and basically everybody leaves, you don't have much really anywhere to go. But the Texans, Davis Mills is probably the best pro on this team. The second one is that their schedules have been relatively easy, and they probably should be, which leaves a lot of room for improvement next year in terms of on paper record, in terms of wins and losses. But the cons, again, and I won't even blame the GM here. I'm gonna blame ownership. I mean, Cal McNair is just awful. I mean, he fired David Culley after one season, and David Culley actually really, I believe, should have been there for at least 2 years. I mean, this is a guy that simped for Bill O'Brien, who was a complete train wreck and should have been fired like 5 years ago, but instead, went all out on a limb for Bill O'Brien, made him the GM. I mean, he has completely alienated his own fan base. I think he should sell the team personally, and that's just me. But the guy is really going to alienate a lot of people. I mean, he's alienated the quarterback of the team, Deshaun Watson. He's alienated the fans, and the Texans are probably going to be a laughingstock unless they find the perfect combination of GM and head coach. And even then, with such a disgrace as an owner, it's going to be difficult to even have faith in this team. And the second con is the cap. I mean, I don't think Houston's actually in a pretty good spot in terms of salary cap. I mean, you look at the list and they're like, middle of the pack. I mean, they're not in a bad spot. I mean, they're only at like, a little over 20 million, but this is a team that has a lot of needs. And this team has had some terrible investments over the years. I have no faith in this team. I'm just going to move on to the New Orleans Saints. Now, this one was a bit of a surprise. This one was actually just announced today, this opening. Now, this was not a firing. Sean Payton left, whether he retired or not, which is what I assume was the case. I won't spend too much time on that. Now, the pros for this team are that the roster has a lot of bright spots. I mean, there's obviously some bright spots on both sides of the ball, which is always a plus. And the second biggest pro on this team is that you have a very talented group of coordinators that you can work with. Now, obviously, a new head coach might want to bring in their own people, but at the very least, that you don't have to necessarily do a whole big restructure on that side of the field. You have coordinators that did a decent job despite the, record the Saints had, and losing a Hall of Fame quarterback and still managing to get just under 500 to me is actually pretty good. Now, the cons, the big one, which was a big problem for them last year, is salary cap. The Saints are dead last in cap. They are 70 million over the cap. So don't expect them to be big players in free agency. People are saying that they'd get Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson. That's a joke. They can't even afford to sign Trevor Siemian to an extension because of how broke they are. And speaking of that, the other problem is the quarterback issue. I mean, whether Jameis Winston stays, which I don't think is a terrible idea, but whether it's him, whether it's somebody new, the Saints really don't have a lot of options. I mean, the Saints are really kind of tied to a lot of people, which isn't always a bad thing, but they might not be able to keep pending free agents, including their blindside tackles. So on paper, this is one of the best jobs because it has the most appeal in terms of roster. But salary cap wise, starting over with possibly a new quarterback, there's a lot of, gray areas that aren't being highlighted enough. The next one on this list is the Minnesota Vikings. And this one, again, much like the other teams that I've named on this list, you look back to the Bears. This one could have been a little bit sooner. Mike Zimmer's overrated. I don't care what anybody says. But the pros on this list are the offense. I mean, again, Mike Zimmer gets way too much credit for this. Clint Kubiak is, obviously the son of an offensive guru who has managed to keep this offense competitive. And to be honest with you, with the exception of maybe the Saints, the Vikings on paper have one of the best offenses on this list in a more complete way. The other pro to consider is that the Vikings actually are a team that stays competitive. I mean, even though they had some areas where things might not have gone right for them this year, they are a team that, despite their salary cap, which is one of my cons, spoiler alert, they've managed to pull off wins when people don't think they will, which you could say that about a lot of teams, but Minnesota's a special kind of team in that sense. Cons are salary cap. I already covered that. They're $12 million over the cap. They can't make any big, they can easily fix that with restructures, but don't expect them to make any big splashes. The second one is their defense. I mean, they have a lot of things on defense they need to fix. They need to find the right coordinator. They need to sign some, new playmakers because a lot of their guys are getting older, and they haven't really gotten much younger at the defensive side of the ball. That's something that needs to change, especially with the rest of the division getting relatively younger. Next is the Dolphins. Brian Flores. People said he shouldn't be fired. Yes, he should have. The fact that they went 1-7 to start the season is never a good thing. And I understand they went on a winning streak to keep them competitive. But in my opinion, at that point, their playoff hopes were almost dead. And that's why Brian Flores was fired. And I think it was the right decision in terms of that. But pros here, I'm going to kind of be a little bit quick about these last two teams. Tua is, of course, someone you can build around, and the team is relatively young. And, of course, the salary cap. The Dolphins have more money in the salary cap than any team in the NFL. So any head coach is going to have a field day with whatever the front office decides to do in terms of big moves. And, of course, if they have some input on it and the Dolphins get really aggressive, which I expect them to, in free agency, this team could be competitive. Cons, of course, for the team are that there's a lot of needs. But again, salary cap could fix this, but it's not going to fix everything, even though you have the most. The Dolphins do have some decent draft capital, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that need to be fixed. And while I do expect the Dolphins to be middle of the pack next year in terms of records, I do think the Dolphins are going to have, I would say 2023 is going to be a competitive year for them. I think 2022 is going to be the start of the rebuild, and I think 2023 is going to be where you really see it start to unfold. And the second con on this list, and this one might come as a surprise, I'm going to say, although Tua is a bright spot on this offense, I think the offense as a whole is still a step behind where they'd like it to be. I think that there's a few things the Dolphins still need to fix. Maybe free agency fixes it. Maybe the draft fixes it. But outside of Devontae Parker, there's not a lot of bright spots on this offense for me. I want to see some more improvement to keep this team competitive, because as great as the Bills are getting, no other offense is even on that, close to that. I mean, the Bills are light years ahead of the Dolphins, and despite them getting the sweep over the Patriots, I still think New England's a better team. But we'll talk about that in a different video. And we're going to end it finally with the one head coach opening that was not announced on Black Monday. Very happy it was announced later. The New York Giants. Joe Judge was completely awful. The guy was an idiot and realistically shouldn't have been hired in the first place. But pros for this team are the fact that you have a couple of pieces that you can work with. Like, Kenny Golladay is a big, wide receiver that never got utilized. Saquon Barkley, if he stays healthy, could be, a good part of that. And you have a relatively young roster. And the last part of this is you have a very easy division. And that's a very, unpopular comment, because a lot of Cowboys fans already think I have it out for them, which is false. But outside of Dallas, even with Philadelphia's improvement, the division really is not that competitive. And if you're the Giants, that gives you a little bit of leg room for a 2 to 3 year rebuild. And for me, that's the best kind of rebuild, because you can take your time with it. Now, the cons, the quarterback position. I was never a fan of Daniel Jones. I never will be. I have questions about that. But the Giants also have some really good draft capital, which is another honorable mention in terms of pros. But the Giants also have a really bad salary cap situation. They have good capital in terms of draft stock, but salary cap, they're under. I mean, if you checked out what I showed you before, I mean, they are $5 million over now. Again, much like Minnesota, that's easy fix. You can easily fix that to be over. But again, the Giants aren't going to be big players in free agency. And they also have a new GM, which could be hit or miss. But that's really all I have for you guys in this video. Basically, plain and simple, there's a lot of room to be positive. I think personally, if we're going to go back and talk about the best openings for me, I think the best openings here would probably be, Denver, the Raiders, and then maybe Jacksonville if, Trent Baalke decides to resign. Worst openings are the Texans, and honestly, the Giants for me are the worst openings. But that's what I've got, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one.